Hello, and welcome to a video in which we read through and analyse an academic paper. This time we're looking at Zhou's Organisational Response to Covid-19 Crisis, Reflections on the Chinese Bureaucracy and its Resilience. As always, it's worth beginning with consideration of the date of publication. Just highlight this quickly. You can see it's July 2022, which is very shortly after the beginning of the Covid-19 crisis and pandemic emergence, not only in China but around the world. So, insofar as the paper will have relevance, it will also have set up certain lessons that we want to learn from the Covid-19 pandemic, and then subsequent literature will almost definitely have responded to those lessons and assessed whether they have been learnt or if they've been ignored. Now, this first paragraph gives essentially a history we don't really need to go back over, but we'll go through it anyway. In Wuhan city in Hubei province, there was a lockdown of the city of 11 million residents. Importantly, as Zhou says, this crystallized the fundamentals of Chinese bureaucracy by forcing it to patch together segments of formal and informal practices for mobilization. Now, in terms of the next section makes a very important point that we are taking something of a mixed approach here, partly comparative, but mostly focusing on a single case study. So as it says at the beginning, the response in China sheds light on the distinctive characteristics of Chinese bureaucracy, the relationships between the central and local governments, and the larger issues about China's governance. The paragraph goes on to say that because this was a worldwide pandemic, we can actually use that to understand individual states' responses and the systems that force those responses. And it allows us to focus, in our instance, on the distinct aspects of the Chinese bureaucracy. This paragraph, well, the next couple of paragraphs, make a very important point regarding different bureaucratic systems. By this point, I'm sure we're all aware of Weberian bureaucracy. I'll take this out of full screen. I've put a note here that will just summarise the points regarding Weberian bureaucracy. It has a hierarchical structure, it has rules-based behaviours, it has professional training and career advancement, and importantly, different parts of the organisation are connected and coordinated by the same chain of command. In comparison, down here we have the loosely coupled system, which is characterised by relatively unresponsiveness or delay between, first, the subunits in an organisation and different organisations themselves; second, the formal rules and actual behaviours, so there's a delay between what should happen and what does happen; and third, a delay between the institutional environment and the internal operations. Okay? As it says quite nicely here, loose coupling, this second system, has the advantage of moving decision-making closer to the levels where information resides, and remember, information is absolutely necessary for good governance, but also it's costly in mobilization across parts of the organisation. So the lack of joining up can be good when it comes to the sharing of information, but it can be bad in terms of the actual implementation of that information. In terms of the actual Chinese bureaucracy itself, as Zhou says here, all local governments are all part of the government hierarchy under the authority of the central government, which means authority is derived purely from delegation. In terms of the history of the Wuhan crisis. As it makes very clear, the timing is critical, and the first response failed miserably. This is where things start to get really interesting. It was not a lack of information. Information is prevalent and available, but information was ignored and suppressed in the bureaucratic machine. So, summarising this, I think this is a very nice summary. It is the organisational failure, not the coronavirus per se, that led to the disastrous consequences that we saw in Wuhan. Now, going back slightly to the first section, as said, there are important similarities around the world. For example, high uncertainty about the contagiousness of the virus and how quickly and silently it spreads before detection. So this isn't something that's unique to China. However, and moreover, as Zhou makes it very clear, most governments failed in their early phases, but it was the different failures. We'll see why in a moment. Goes through some very nice data, some very clear empirical data. The frequency of search on China's internet shows the tale of two periods, before and after 20th of January 2020. Before the 20th of January 2020, there is very little information in the public domain. But after that date, when China essentially recognises the existence of the coronavirus, there is a huge increase in information and response to the crisis. This isn't just on the internet, however. It says the same thing in major Chinese newspapers. Two newspapers are considered here. One is the official newspaper in Wuhan, and the other is the official newspaper of Hubei, but is located in Wuhan. And again, the same thing. Before January the 20th, there was very little information, and then immediately after, there was, to use Zhou's words, a small flurry of news reports. Those are on figures 1 and 2. So figure 1 is in the top right of the screen at the moment, and then figure 2 is on the top left-hand screen. These are worth looking at in your own time. Now, it's important to remember the World Health Organization was notified actually before the 20th of January, but the government refused to recognise the existence. And actually, as Zhou says here, this fits a pattern to make problems disappear at all costs. Again, if we go back to Zhou's claim up here that it was organisational failure, we can see that the institutional arrangements for reporting and for dealing with crises was actually well established following the SARS pandemic. But in fact, the institutional arrangements were in place, but it was the politicisation of this crisis that led to the suppression of information. There's a nice sort of summary, or what should we say, exemplary issue here. 8 individuals, among them medical professionals, were forced to admit their wrongdoing in spreading rumours, and they were reprimanded on national television. This was prior to the 20th of January 2020. Now, in terms of what actually happened in the reporting of the coronavirus, as it says, several tensions are worth noting. The first is the disconnect between medical professionals and political professionals. As it says, those in political positions, such as the heads of Wuhan Central Central Hospital, overruled professional judgment and silenced their voice. One particular doctor, Dr. Ai Fan, was criticised by the party disciplinary office for spreading information about the coronavirus pandemic, for not upholding professional principle, spreading rumours, creating panic, and affecting stability and development in Wuhan. Incidents were not just in one hospital, so this is not an isolated incident, this is across the institutional arrangement. In many cases, doctors were reprimanded by higher authorities for lacking political awareness, and I think this part in green here that I've put is very important. There was an absence of independent channels of information processing and transmission that may otherwise make the critical information publicly available. What's important here, this is the third section, this isn't, so we've gone from the first tension being in, say, one individual hospital. Then the second tension is, actually this is across multiple hospitals, multiple professional institutions. But then the third point is, this isn't just in medical and research institutions, this is across government institutions as well. As it says, officials at the epicenter of Wuhan and Hubei province behaved in the same way in withholding and suppressing information. I meant to highlight that. Now, this second part of this section turns to a slightly comparative approach. So as I said, we're not just considering China, we are considering other institutions as well. So, figure 3, which comes over to the top left page now, is the frequency of news items on coronavirus in the United States. Okay, so I think Zhou's summary here is quite important and very useful. Both nations and states failed miserably, but for different reasons. In the United States, it was not a lack of information, rather it was bureaucratic negligence and misjudgments. But there was no evidence of withholding information on political considerations. In China, however, it's the opposite. It's not the lack of information or even bureaucratic inertia. There's a very, very important point, which will come out in the next section, but here it's actually that the Chinese officials were highly sensitive to the information, but they acted in perhaps the wrong way in terms of political reasons as opposed to practical reasons. And I think this sentence, which we can actually put into green, officials responded quickly and decisively but followed political logic. The principle of political stability took precedence in organisational response. And as a result, finishing off this section, 2 key characteristics stand out. First, politicisation of the bureaucracy, and second, strong organisational capacity and demobilisation. So, this isn't just an issue in coronavirus, this is an issue across Chinese bureaucracy, but coronavirus revealed those problems, probably more than any other crisis. And, as the section finishes on, this is actually a result of re-centralisation. So let's turn to re-centralisation here. There are distinct characteristics in the Chinese bureaucracy. First, the centralisation of authority across the entire. Obviously, most students listening to this are from China, so you don't need me to tell you this, but China is huge, incredibly diverse in terms of both culture and economy. So having a single centralised government across that whole country requires a certain degree of centralisation. And as it says, the process of the organisational centralisation creates a bureaucracy which is a multi-layered hierarchy under the party line. Now, with this in mind, as it says here, one defining characteristic is the delegation of power by the central authority. We've already covered that earlier in the paper, but this really has to be hammered home here. The system is designed for the implementation of top-down directives, which the top leaders, essentially the party apparatchiks, control, mostly through political mechanisms and patronage relationships. However, and this is the important point that Zhou moves on to here. This is the sort of traditional image of the authoritarian state in China. But there's nuance, and there's nuance that we need to be conscious of, especially when it comes to local bureaucracy. First off, there's a fundamental tension in China's governance between the centralisation of authority and the effectiveness in local governments. First off, authority weakens the effectiveness of local governments, but that creates political pressure for decentralisation. However, decentralisation leads to deviations from the central authority, which induces top leaders' efforts for recentralisation. Now, the important point to make is that political mechanisms, as it says, are based on the upward accountability. But there's also a significant amount of informal or behavioural decentralisation. And this, as it says, I think this is quite a nice summary sentence, this has induced cycles of centralisation and decentralisation in China's political process. I have put a note, it's on the next page. So in the next section we'll see a little bit more detail here about the fact that in the post-Mao era, China experienced a grand trend of decentralisation, but as it says in the following paragraph, almost the opposite has been taking place now. The trend of recentralisation has greatly accelerated. The Leninist Party strengthens its party committees in workplaces, from government agencies to companies, universities and social organisations. And then, and this paper is very good on empirical data, if you look at figure number 4, which is in the top left of this screen now, so take a look at that in your own time. Figure 4 shows the prevalence of official rhetoric and associated political pressures, and shows that they had been mounting and intensifying, especially leading up to the eve of the Covid-19 outbreak. Finally, and this is worth just reiterating, during the outbreak, political considerations took precedence over professional judgment. As a result, it's worth pointing out that the tightly coupled system is effective in downward policy implementation, but as a result of this, it actually discourages upward information transmission. Okay, so the state is very effective at handing orders down from the top, but it discourages the transmission of information necessary to do effective policy implementation. But I think it's worth coming now to the point about bureaucratic personality. Again, there will be more on this in the next section, but bureaucrats in China are not necessarily rigid in rule following, they're actually quite sensitive to political pressures, but it depends where those pressures come from. If they're coming from below in terms of a desire for decentralisation, they can move in favour of that. If they're coming from above in terms of recentralisation, they can move in favour of that as well. So, what this reveals is a strong and impersonal grip of the bureaucratic logic on officials, as well as professionals, in shaping the kind of early response in Wuhan to the outbreak. Now, what does this mean? This is where we come to the point of this paper, really. What does this mean? What's this going to do for us in terms of lessons for the Chinese bureaucratic state? This paragraph here is a very good summary of the history of decentralisation in China prior to 2010. Now, I'm not going to go through all of it, but this is a good example of doing just quick summary. That paragraph's probably about 200 words. To finish that paragraph, however, is a very important point here. because local initiatives are essentially generated with practical circumstances in mind, and therefore local conditions, they're more likely to achieve better performance, so decentralisation results in organisational resilience. But, as the next paragraph says, here's the problem. The Tale of Two Periods highlights the two features of the Chinese bureaucracy: the high mobilisational capacity of the Chinese bureaucracy and the underlying political mechanisms. They serve as a two-edged weapon, the causes of both organisational failure in the first period and also the successful lockdown implementation of the second period. So the current system in the Chinese bureaucracy means that the pre-pandemic problems were the lack of information transmission. But the same system meant that when the pandemic was announced and recognised by the state, it had a very effective and strong response. However, this is quite interesting. There's an explicit reference to Weber here. Now, we've done Weberian bureaucracy in this module, so this should be something that you're quite knowledgeable on. One of the points that Weber makes is the idea of authority and where it comes from and the traditional bases of authority. And one of those is charisma. Zhou makes it clear there's a significant element of charismatic authority and the charisma of office that's been built into political institutions. If we turn back to figure 4, rhetoric emphasises political loyalty and following the party line, and it projects the image that the top is invincible and can do no wrong. But the pandemic raises issues about the practice on which charismatic authority has been built. If the Chinese state admits organisational failure, then it admits that the systems built on charismatic authority might be wrong. And in that regard, professional autonomy undermines the authoritarian practice in China's governance and presents a challenge to the political authority. So there's a certain point where the Chinese government has to refuse to admit problems. And this is going to be the issue. Organisational learning will not take place because of this. So to summarise the final couple of paragraphs, path dependency that Kenneth Arrow recognised means that China's system is essentially at a crossroads. It either has to pursue decentralisation again and admit that the rationale for its bureaucracy is wrong, or, and this is the more likely outcome, it refuses to admit that because it can't without undermining the whole system upon which it's built. So what does this mean for us? Does this mean that China is actually going to learn from the pandemic? I think Zhou's answer is probably not. Thank you very much for listening. I hope this has been helpful, and I'll see you in the next video.